Welcome to Terran Apex Protocol, where the galaxy keeps underestimating humanity and keeps regretting it. If these stories are your kind of story, subscribe and stay with us. My name's Atlas. In a galaxy that writes off the missing with the ring of a bell, one woman refused to stop keeping the light. And the galaxy was about to find out exactly what that cost her, and exactly what it saved. Let's begin. Solveig Han checked the fuel cell first. She always checked the fuel cell first. It was not a rule she had written down anywhere. It had become a rule the way that most important things become rules. Gradually, through repetition, until the day she realized she had not once forgotten to do it in 40 years, and understood this was not an accident. She rose, checked the overnight logs, checked the atmospheric seals on the outer hull, drank something hot, and then walked the 43 steps from the bunk room to the relay housing and read the fuel cell. The order never varied. The fuel cell was never below capacity. She made sure of that with the full weight of her attention and none of the distraction she allowed herself everywhere else. The readout said 112% reserve. She made a note in the log and moved on. Outside the porthole above the workstation, the marrow pressed up against the station's running lights, like something that had been waiting there a long time. It was not waiting. It had no intention, no awareness, no preference about anything. It was a navigational dead zone, a slow churning mass of charged debris fields, and magnetic interference, and gravitic eddies, that swallowed drive signals and bent transmission paths, and made the 600 light-year run between the inner colonies and the outer reach, a problem that required professional management. Ships threaded the marrow by relay, beacon to beacon, station to station, each keeper maintaining their slice of the corridor, so the signal chain stayed live and the freighters and colony transports could find their way through. Relay Station Lamplight was one such link. Call sign Lamplight, Human Navigational Authority Registry, currently staffed by one keeper instead of its required two, currently running on a budget that had been restructured once and formally reduced twice in the last 15 years, currently the subject of a formal decommission order that sat in the administrative folder on Solveig's desk with the green pending stamp, and the Concord of Rest's official seal, and the signature of Registrar Zell himself, indicating that someone in the organization had decided she merited senior attention. She had not signed it. She was 67 years old. She had kept this light burning since she was 26, and she had no particular intention of stopping. And she had made that clear to enough people over enough years that she had stopped expecting the position to surprise anyone. Lamplight's beacon sent its pulse into the dark on a 20-second cycle, the same as it had since the day. Solveig and Bram had powered up the array together and watched the first signal go out. She had watched that pulse with Bram's hand on her shoulder and the feeling of beginning something that would matter. She had not been wrong about that. She had not understood at 26 the full shape of what mattering would require. The second chair at the workstation was empty. It had been empty for 27 years. She sat down in her chair and opened the morning logs and got to work. 3 days before the Concord liaison arrived, the formal notification had come through on the administrative channel, the one Solveig checked last, because the administrative channel existed to deliver things she already knew were coming. The message was crisp and efficiently worded and signed by Registrar Zell personally, which told her that decades of correspondence had finally exhausted the Concord's patience for working through intermediaries. The Concord of Rest was the oldest navigational authority in the Outer Reach, and its most significant contribution to the corridor's safety was not its charts, or its fleet of inspection vessels, or its 3,000 registered relay stations. It was the doctrine of the cessation, which everyone in the relay service called the bell, because the morning notification the doctrine required was broadcast on a specific low frequency that translated across most species audio ranges as a deep, resonant tone, unmistakable, final, and designed to be heard. The bell's logic was clean. A ship that missed its return window by 72 hours was designated lost. At 96 hours, the registry struck the name from the active list. At 120 hours, the cessation took effect. The ship was declared dead, the formal mourning period began, and every beacon operator within the ship's registered corridor was required to ring the bell. A broadcast acknowledgement that the search was closed, and then extinguish their dedicated signal. Navigation for the rest of the corridor continued. Life went on. That was the point. The Concorde had spent generations explaining that the bell was not cruel. The galaxy could not grieve every absence indefinitely. Beacons had operational lifespans. Relay keepers had operational lifespans. Resources spent maintaining hope past its reasonable horizon were resources not spent on people who were actually alive and present and needed them. The bell closed the wound cleanly. The bell let the living live. The bell notification for the transport Meridian had arrived at lamplight 39 years ago, at 0400 station time, in the same format as every other administrative notification. Solveig had been awake because she was usually awake at 0400. She had read it, acknowledged receipt, filed it, and then sat at the workstation for a while, looking at the dark outside the porthole. Then she had checked the fuel cell. 112% reserve. She had kept it there ever since. She had sent the Human Navigational Authority a message explaining her intention to maintain Lamplight's signal on the Meridian's registered corridor until she had reason to believe the ship was genuinely unrecoverable. The HNA had replied with a politely phrased request for compliance. She had acknowledged the request and kept the light on. The exchange had repeated itself in letters of escalating formality and varying degrees of frustration for 39 years. At some point, Registrar Zell had apparently decided that a personal envoy would accomplish what correspondence had not. The Meridian had left for the outer reach with 3,106 colonists in cryo and a crew of 17. Captain Adeze Okoye, Master. She had taught Solveig navigational calculus when Solveig was 19 and new to the relay service, chalk-handed and stubborn, with a tendency to argue back that Okoye had found either irritating or endearing depending on the day. Okoye used to say that the best navigators were the ones who could hold a fixed point in their mind under pressure, who could see the heading and keep to it even when everything else was shifting. Solveig had taken this as professional advice, and she had also taken it as something else, something she had been living by for 4 decades. She was keeping a fixed point. She was keeping to the heading. Liaison Corps arrived on a Concorde courier at 0700 station time, which meant he had made good speed from the inner network and had been cleared to jump early, which meant someone above him had prioritized this dispatch. The courier was small and clean and efficient, the kind of ship that existed to move officials rather than cargo, and it docked at Lamplight's external airlock with the quiet assurance of institutional authority accustomed to having doors opened for it. Core was Drath, broadly humanoid in the way that most spacefaring species in the Reach were broadly humanoid if you didn't examine the specifics too closely. Tall, cool-skinned, moving, with a deliberate economy of motion that suggested someone trained to navigate confined spaces without appearing to need more room than was available. The bioluminescent membranes that traced his jawline and collarbone glowed a steady, even blue. The color of someone who knows what they are here to do and has organized the relevant arguments in advance. He carried the decommission order queued to the signature page on a data slate. He had clearly been briefed extensively. He did not look surprised by the state of the station, older than current regulation required, more patched than spec called for, but running, very clearly running, every system in proper order and every log up to date. He had the look of someone who had read a comprehensive file and was now adjusting for the gap between a file and the actual person. Solveig offered tea. He declined, which she had anticipated. He recited the order. It was a thorough recitation, not unkind, but organized for precision rather than comfort, laying out the Concord's position in the kind of language that had been designed to be difficult to argue with rather than easy to dismiss. The cessation had been properly filed. The mourning period had concluded under valid interstellar law. Maintaining a dedicated beacon for a registry that had been struck was a simultaneous violation of resource protocols, registry codes, and grief doctrine. The decommission was the conclusion of a long, patient, more than accommodating administrative process. He finished. He looked at her. "Your rule says I should grieve on schedule," she said. "I've never been good at schedules." Core's membranes flickered. A brief, sharp brightening, then back to steady. He was recalibrating, clearly, reassessing the gap between the file and the person. She could see him reorganizing his approach. "The cessation doctrine exists," he said carefully, "because the alternatives have proven catastrophic. Not theoretically. Historically. Civilizations that refused to ring the bell, that kept vigils indefinitely, kept diverting resources, kept sending vessels into dead corridors, were not more compassionate. They were beggared. The Concord of Rest was built precisely to prevent that outcome. I understand this has a personal dimension for you." "It has several dimensions," Solveig said. "Personal is one of them." She paused. He waited. "The Meridian had 3,106 people in cryo," she said. "That's not a personal number. That's a navigational problem. And there is a non-zero probability, which I have calculated 39 years running, that those people are still in the dark and still looking for a light. The probability after 39 years is not zero," she said. She said it pleasantly. "And that is the only probability I am working with." Core looked at her for a long moment. His membranes held level, steady, the even blue of a being containing a response he was reconsidering. "I have 3 days before my return window," he said. "Stay as long as you like," Solveig told him. "There's tea if you change your mind." Core had come to switch off one stubborn old woman's light. He had not been told it was the only light for 9,000 cubic light years, and that something out in the dark might still be looking for it. Core was, whatever else he was, thorough. He filed the procedural documents the decommission process required, contacted the HNA representative assigned to the lamplight case, and set up a proper working space on his courier to organize the findings. He asked Solveig for access to the station's systems for the purpose of documenting the decommission report. She gave him access to everything except the fuel cell control panel. He started with the maintenance logs because he needed the resource expenditure figures. Solveig showed him the east wall. The fuel logs and maintenance records and beacon calibration sheets for 39 years of operation at lamplight had outgrown 2 shelving units and then a third, and were now filling 6 shelving units and beginning a 7th. Every binder was dated and labeled in the same handwriting. Clear, angular, slightly left-leaning, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write in conditions where clarity mattered more than elegance. Every binder from years 1 through 12 was annotated throughout in a second handwriting. Smaller, neater, the slight rightward slant of someone formally trained before they learned to work quickly. Core pulled volume 4 from year 7 and read 3 pages. Then he set it down and looked at the binders more carefully. 2 keepers, he said. Not a question. Through year 12, Solveig said. She was at the board, running the mid-morning transponder sweep, her back to him. He looked at the second writing. He looked at the east wall. He was doing the calculation she had watched everyone do when they came to this point in the conversation. The calculation about what the scale of the wall implied about the scale of the commitment and the person who had kept it. "The second keeper," he said. "What happened to them?" "His name was Bram Odia," she said. "He came with me at the start. He was 22, fresh out of relay training, first assignment. He stayed because he believed it was right to stay, and then because it was home, and then because the light needed two people, and I needed one of them to be him." She paused. "He died during the 57 storm event, in year 12. A long silence. "I kept the log in his handwriting after that," she said. "It seemed right. He would have been meticulous about it." Kor set down the binder. His membranes had shifted. Not grief, exactly, not the blue of administrative certainty, something in the range between the two that she would learn to read, as the Drath expression for absorbing a fact that restructures the surrounding data. "He is still here," Kor said. "He was looking at the ashes behind the fuel cell housing, somehow." She had not told him yet. He seemed to know anyway. Behind the fuel cell housing, she confirmed. He thought that location was funny. He had a very specific sense of humor. She said it with the tone of someone noting a preference for a particular kind of tea. Kor did not know what to do with that. He went back to the logs. He was reading them differently now. On the third day, the Concorde cut the power. It was an administrative tool, an authorized reduction of resource allotment to a non-compliant station, legal under navigational codes, designed to make continued non-compliance impractical rather than merely prohibited. A clean enforcement mechanism. Solveig's external power allotment dropped to 28% of nominal. That was enough for life support, minimal communications, and approximately 40% of the beacon array's operational requirements. 40% of the array's operational requirements was not enough to project a signal usefully into the Marrow's interference field. Everyone involved understood this. The Concorde had done the math, and the math was the point. Solveig watched the power curve drop on the monitoring board with the expression of a person who has planned for exactly this and finds the moment of its arrival less satisfying than she expected, because planning does not prevent the thing from being unpleasant. Then she opened the internal reserve panel. She had spent 15 years building Lamplight's internal life support reserves to 400% of standard specification. The purchases had gone through the station's maintenance budget under the category of emergency preparedness equipment, which was accurate in the same way that calling a load-bearing wall a partition was accurate. She rerouted the internal reserves to the beacon array. She dropped her own environmental systems to minimum operational margins. The beacon held. 20-second cycle. 112% reserve. Kor found her at the fuel cell housing 40 minutes later, making a manual adjustment to the reserve routing with a torque wrench. He had been watching the power board from his console on the courier and had seen the reserve reroute in the telemetry. His membranes, when he appeared in the housing doorway, were guttering, cycling between brightness and near dark in the low, uncertain flicker of a being whose internal certainty has been destabilized. She looked up. She went back to the wrench. "You have reduced your own oxygen buffer by 60%, he said. "The beacon needs it more than I do right now," she said. The adjustment required a specific angle. She gave it her attention. "That is not how resource triage is supposed to. You ask why the light's still on," she said, not looking up from the housing panel. "It's been on 40 years. It stays on till someone comes home or I don't." She said it without drama, without weight, in the same tone as reading the fuel cell. Kor stood in the doorway and did not speak for a long time. When she looked up, he was still there. He sat down on the floor with his back against the doorframe. Solveig looked at him. She set down the wrench and sat down across from him, her back against the fuel cell housing, 3 centimeters of panel wall between her shoulder and the sealed compartment where Bram's ashes had been for 27 years. "Tell me," Kor said, "about the storm." "Year 12, she told him. The Concorde had a word for keeping a light past the bell. The word was cruelty. There was no word yet for the other thing, the thing that had not happened in 200 years of ringing it. The 57 storm event had been, and remained, the worst documented marrow disruption in the navigational record for this corridor. It lasted 71 hours. The initial surge had physically destroyed the array equipment on 2 relay stations and driven a cargo freighter so far off its registered path that it had taken 4 days to find again. The charts they had at the time gave it a maximum rating on the disruption scale. The charts had since been updated to add a new category above maximum. Bram had gone outside at hour 6 to run manual stabilization on the array housing, because the housing's automated stabilization system had gone offline in the first surge, and the array was starting to drift. A drifting array meant a drifting signal. A drifting signal could not be reliably locked onto. A signal that could not be locked onto was not a beacon, and if the beacon was not a beacon, then everything they had been doing, the years, the arguments with the HNA, the specific belief that someone out in the marrow was navigating by this light, became nothing. Bram had suited up, checked his equipment, and gone out into a marrow storm in a hard suit that would keep him alive as long as the electronics held, which was not a guarantee anyone could give in a surge environment. They had not discussed it at length. They had looked at each other over the board, and he had said, "I'll take the manual protocols," and she had said, "Hold the anchor clamp," and he had said yes, and that had been the conversation. He had been outside 3 hours when the second major surge hit. The hard suit's electronics went out. All of them simultaneously. Navigation assist, environmental monitoring, the suit's automatic anchor clamp that would have locked him to the array housing, the communication link. The telemetry screen in front of Solveig went blank in the middle of showing her that everything was fine. She had sat with the blank screen and done her job, and run the array controls and checked the beacon pulse, and managed the power routing through the surge, and done her job, because one person at the board was the minimum required to keep the signal active, and one person in a dead hard suit in a marrow storm was the maximum she could allow herself to think about. Bram had kept working. The array housing had the manual failsafe systems that the Human Navigational Authority had insisted on, including over the objections of the stations that considered them archaic weight and expense. Emergency levers, mechanical override controls, systems that needed human hands and human muscle rather than electronics to operate. Bram had trained on them. He had thought training on them was slightly ridiculous, and had said so at the time, in the good-natured way of a man who did not mind being wrong about things that did not cost him anything to be wrong about. In the 3rd hour of a marrow storm with no suit electronics, and nothing but the work and his hands, and the specific architecture of who he was, Bram Oduya had run the manual stabilization protocol on a drifting array housing and held it aligned through 90 minutes of active surge. The array held. The signal went out on the 20-second cycle, steady, unchanged, nominal. When the surge passed, he came back inside. He ran through decompression. He came out of the suit. He sat down at the workstation, and he made his log entries in the precise, neat handwriting that Solveig would keep filing under his name for 27 years after he was gone. The second-to-last entry read, "Second surge cleared. Array nominal. Signal strong. No change to protocol." The last entry was 3 words, and then it stopped. He died in the chair. Cardiac arrest, 44 years old, with the signal going out every 20 seconds behind him, and no way of knowing whether it would ever matter, and no way of asking the question. because the asking and the answering were separated by the full weight of what keeping the light had cost him. "I found him at the board," Solveig said. "She was looking at the wall, not at Core. I thought he'd fallen asleep. He used to sleep at the board during long watches. I called his name. Then I ran the checks, because he would have been angry with me if I hadn't run the checks first, and he was right to be. The array was nominal. The signal was strong. Then I went to him." She paused. The beacon pulsed. "He kept the light," she said. "He died keeping the light on, and he never got to know if it would matter. And I have been carrying that ever since because I am the one who has to find out. I have to be the one who knows the answer to the question he never got to ask. Not because I'm certain the meridian is coming. I passed certain a long time ago. I keep the light because letting it go would mean his answer was nothing. That Bram died in that chair for a light I switched off. I will not do that. I will maintain this beacon until the meridian comes home, or I die at this board the same way he did, and I am at peace with both outcomes." Core's hands, resting on his knees, were completely still. He was a being trained to evaluate situations and determine appropriate administrative responses, sitting on the floor of a fuel cell housing at the edge of a navigational dead zone, and he did not have an appropriate response. "Hope isn't free," Solveig said quietly. "I know exactly what it cost." His name was Bram. The signal went out. 20-second cycle. The marrow absorbed it, and the marrow gave nothing back. Then the signal board went active. The alert was a soft triple tone that she had configured herself when she replaced the original alert hardware, because the original had been too quiet and she had not wanted to miss it. She heard it, and she looked at Core, briefly, and she was at the board in 4 steps. The signal was coming from deep in the marrow, from a bearing that crossed 4 active debris fields and matched nothing in the current active registry. Because the transponder record it matched had been struck 39 years ago and filed under Retrider in a folder that Solveig had never let herself delete. She ran the frequency correlation twice. She pulled the old transponder record and cross-referenced the modulation signature. She ran it a 3rd time, because she was 67 years old, and she had been doing this for 4 decades, and she was going to be completely sure before she opened her mouth. "Lamplight, please respond. Navigation dead. Drive reserve critical. Cryo integrity failing on sections 4 through 9. We are navigating by last known beacon lock. Please respond. This is the transport meridian. Lamplight, please respond." The voice was older. 40 years older, worn at the edges in the way of a voice that has been managing a slow crisis in measured increments for a very long time. It was unmistakably the voice of Captain Adeze Okoye. Core had come off the floor. He was at the secondary comm panel, his membranes blazing suddenly, bright and warm and unstable, cycling through colors that Solveig did not have names for. She pressed the transmit key. Her hand was completely steady. "Meridian, this is Lamplight. We have your signal. You're clear to approach. The light's on. 40 years of fuel logs, 40 years of refused orders, 40 years of one woman saying not yet. And out in the marrow, for the first time, something said the same thing back. Okoye told her in the first 4 minutes what had happened. The Meridian had entered the marrow on schedule 40 years ago and found conditions significantly worse than the navigational charts predicted. A primary drive failure 40 light-years deep in the dead zone was not survivable by normal calculation. Okoye had decided normal did not apply, put the crew to emergency protocols, and began navigating by stellar drift correction and manual calculation toward the nearest beacon lock they could acquire, which was Lamplight. In year 4, the automated navigation array had failed completely. They had been navigating manually since, dead reckoning through the marrow, burning their reserve fuel with careful discipline, keeping the cryo units on full power allocation, because the 3,000 people asleep in those units were not a variable Okoye was willing to compromise. 3 years ago, sections 4 through 9 had started showing cryo-integrity warnings. Okoye had woken the section leads, then a maintenance crew, then everyone necessary to run 209 failing cryo units by hand, because the alternative was not an alternative. There were currently 106 people awake on a ship designed for 17, rationing everything, keeping the cryo units running through brute attention, and navigating by a single beacon lock. They were on the last of their drive reserve. They were navigating on the one light that had been lit in this corridor. They were navigating on the specific non-negotiable fact that Solveig Han had not rung the bell. We need medical teams and cryo-maintenance crews standing by at the dock, Solveig said to Kor without turning from the board. She was already running the approach calculation. Can your courier relay the request? He was already at the secondary comm. Already done, he said. The approach corridor through the Marrow's outer edge was narrow, and the Meridian's drive reserve was burning down faster than Solveig liked. She recalculated, because the corridor chart was 40 years old and debris fields move, and she had been mapping this particular stretch of the Marrow for the entire length of that time, and knew where the chart had gone wrong and where the clearance was and where it was not. You have a window at bearing 274 mark -11, she said into the comm. 14 degrees of clearance on your port side. Do not use it unless your actual heading requires a correction of more than 8 degrees. Do you copy? Copy, lamplight. Bearing 274 mark -11. I have it. Hold your heading. The eddies near the outer edge will push you starboard. Correct for them early. Drive reserve at 0.2%. Hold your heading, she said again. I've got you. She had not let herself feel anything yet. There was a procedure in front of her, a navigation problem, a set of variables that needed managing, and she was managing them. Feeling things was for later. She worked the approach board with 40 years of precision and did not let herself think about what it meant that there was a voice on the channel, because thinking about what it meant was for later too. Kor was beside her now at the secondary panel, feeding her data as he pulled it from the courier's sensors. He was doing this without being asked, quietly and efficiently, and the data was good. She incorporated it without comment. Solveig Okoye said from the Meridian, "How long has the light been on?" 40 years, Solveig said. There was a silence from the Meridian's end. The silence of a person who has had a very large thing drop on them and has chosen to receive it quietly, because there is flying to do and the landing is not finished. The other beacons, Okoye said, in the corridor. All off, Solveig said, decommissioned on schedule. She let a beat pass, ours wasn't. Another silence. Shorter. Correct 6 degrees starboard, Solveig said. You're drifting. She worked the board. The drive reserve reading ticked down, 0.1, 0.08, 0.06. She did not look away from the board. She did not need to. She had memorized this approach corridor over 4 decades of watching it from the inside out, and every correction she called was already forming in her mind before the numbers on the screen confirmed it. Kor stayed at the secondary panel and kept the data flowing. The Meridian kept coming. Outside the porthole, the Marrow's edge was luminous with the interference of the ship's passage through it, the debris field lighting up in patterns that meant a hull was moving through it for the first time in a long time. Drive reserve at 0.04. Hold your heading, she said. Almost through. 0.02. She pulled the corridor map and confirmed the last clearance window, and the map was wrong. The clearance, the 40-year-old chart, showed on the Meridian's starboard side was gone, closed by 4 decades of debris drift that no one had been out here to log, and the heading she had been about to call would have put the transport into a field that her own chart swore was empty. She caught it because she had watched this stretch of the marrow move for 40 years, and some part of her had never quite trusted the paper. Her hand stopped over the transmit key. The Meridian's mass was significant, and its thrusters were nearly dry, which meant she had one correction left to call, and she needed it to be right, and the chart was no longer the thing she could trust to make it right. She closed the chart and worked from the live sensor return, and the 4 decades of the marrow she carried behind her eyes, checked it once, and called it. Solveig, hold your bearing exactly. Do not correct. You are on the line. 40 years, and the human kept the lights on. The words came through the speaker on Core's secondary panel, from the Concord Courier's comm feed. Core had been running a relay to his ship so the approach data could be logged, and he had not known that Registrar Zell was monitoring the feed from the courier. Zell had been monitoring it since Core's distress flag went through, approximately 90 seconds after the signal board went active, approximately 60 seconds after Core had looked at the board and the approach calculation and understood what was unfolding. Zell's voice was old and still, the voice of someone watching a structural calculation they built their career on produce an answer they did not account for. Not triumph in the voice, not defeat. Something that had no clean name. 14 degrees, port side, Solveig said to Okoye. Hold your line. Lamplight, Okoye said, I'm holding. Drive reserve at 0.04. 0.02. The display held on 0 for a long moment. The Meridian came out of the marrow on momentum and emergency thrusters, and the slow, massive persistence of a ship that had been surviving by refusal for 40 years. Running lights minimal. Hull plates dark and pitted with 4 decades of drift debris. The name still legible on the forward section in letters worn gray by the marrow's interference field, but readable if you knew where to look. Moving with the unhurried dignity of something that has been dying for a very long time and has simply decided not to finish. Core had gone very still beside her, his whole attention on the sensor feed, and then the Meridian cleared the last debris band and he exhaled. Lamplight, the Meridian said, we are clear of the marrow. Drive reserve is at 0. We are on approach to harbor on emergency thrusters. We are coming in. Solveig let out one breath. One measured, deliberate breath. Then she picked up the comm. A daisy, she said. It was the first time she had used a first name since Core arrived. We need medical and cryo maintenance at the dock. Sections 4 through 9, priority. You have time. You made it. A pause. The length of 40 years of silence, compressed into 4 seconds. I know, Okoye said. I could see the light. 3,106 colonists came to harbor at Relay Station Lamplight. 3,000 were still in cryo. The viable units holding under the maintenance crew's hands, the Concord Courier's medical team coming aboard within minutes of docking, running their assessments, beginning the careful work of preparation for transfer to a proper medical facility. 106 were awake. They came off the Meridian's ramp in small groups, hollow-eyed and thin, and carrying the quality of people who have been surviving rather than living, who have been managing a slow emergency for so long, that the end of the emergency does not feel real yet. Several of them found a patch of docking bay floor and sat down on it without ceremony and stayed there for a while. This seemed entirely reasonable to everyone present. Okoye came off last. She was 68 years old, and she looked it, 4 decades on a dying ship, having not been kind to the body, however decisive they had been to the character. She moved with the careful gait of a person whose body understood. The crisis was over before the mind had caught up. She crossed the docking bay and stopped in front of Solveig. You kept the light, she said. I kept the light, Solveig confirmed. There was not a great deal more that needed to be said immediately. They had 40 years of silence between them, and it was not going to be dismantled in a docking bay. Okoye put her hand on Solveig's shoulder, briefly, in the way of an old teacher acknowledging something a student did right. Solveig put her hand over Okoye's, briefly. That was enough for now. Kor stood at the edge of the bay and watched. His membranes held that warm, unsteady light that was not the administrative blue he had arrived with, and was something he did not have a clean draft name for. He was thinking about 6 shelving units of binders. He was thinking about a man who died in a chair with the signal going out behind him, never knowing if it would matter. He went back to the courier to write his report. Registrar Zell had watched the meridian come out of the marrow and had remained on the feed as the colonists came off the ramp. He watched for a long time without speaking. Zell's people had not had the bell once. The Drath had nearly ended themselves in the catastrophale they called the beggary, fleets dispatched into the dark after ships that were not coming back, resources stripped from living communities to fund vigils that found nothing, a civilization that had eaten its own reserves down to the bone on the terrible generosity of refusing to let go. The Concord of Rest had been built from the rubble of that failure, carefully and deliberately, and the bell had been its core doctrine from the beginning. Zell had spent 40 years enforcing the bell because he had seen, in the historical record and in the faces of the elders who remembered the beggary, what the alternative had cost. He was not wrong about any of it. He had only failed to ask one question, and he had never once had to ask it before. He held that for a long time. Then he began drafting his response. The formal report reached Zell's desk 6 days after the Meridian's arrival. It was comprehensive and accurate, and it documented everything: the decommission order, the enforcement action, the station's condition, the keeper's refusal, the Meridian's emergence, and the role of Lamplight's beacon as the one navigational reference that had guided 3,106 human colonists out of a dead zone where every other light had been extinguished per doctrine. Attached was a proposed amendment Zell had not requested, labeled the Bram Oduya provision, 1 beacon per lost ship per corridor, maintained at minimal power for 30 standard years, renewable once on documented petition. Zell read the proposal twice. He held it against the full weight of the beggary and the 200 years of successful doctrine it had built. He thought about what the bell was for and about what it had, in this specific and concrete instance, been 2 days away from permanently destroying. He wrote his endorsement. When the amendment came to the full Concord Assembly, Zell stood at the speaker's position and held the floor for 6 minutes. He walked through the case. He walked through the beggary, because the Assembly needed to understand that the bell had not been a mistake, and the amendment was not a repudiation. He walked through Bram Oduya's name and what it meant that the provision bore it. Then he held the floor a moment longer and said the only thing he had come to say. "We made a law to spare the living the cost of hope," Zell said, "and forgot to ask the lost what it costs to come home to a dark sky." The amendment passed. It was not a close vote. Kor found Solveig in the operations room 12 days after the Meridian's arrival. She was at the workstation, running the morning checks. Okoye was in the bunk room on medical rest, and, from the sound of things, a calm argument about navigation theory being conducted at moderate volume through the wall. The medical rest was being observed in a theoretical sense. "The Concord has offered you the Keeper's citation," Kor said. Registrar Zell signed the nomination personally. "It is the highest honor for navigational service in the Reach." "I know," Solveig said. "You've declined." "I have a light to maintain," she said, making a note in the log. She wrote in the neat angular script that had filled the first column of every binder for 4 decades, and an old friend who needs a few weeks before she can fly again. "And about 40 years of accumulated station maintenance I've been deferring because there was only one of me to do both." She paused. Also, someone needs to help the Woken crew file their back paperwork, and 40 years of accumulated navigational paperwork is a considerable undertaking. She said it in the tone of someone going through a maintenance checklist. Kor stood in the doorway and looked at the east wall. He looked at the 7 shelving units, at the 2 handwritings that made up 4 decades of careful, irreplaceable work, and he understood that the citation had nothing to offer a woman who had already been paid in the only currency that meant anything to her, and had paid in it too. Kor's membranes held their warm, steady light. He had learned, in the weeks at Lamplight, that some things did not require a response and would be diminished by one. He let it stand. He left 2 days later. Before he filed the departure checklist, he added 1 item to the navigational equipment manifest under personal authorization, 1 compact standard issue beacon, registered to Liaison Kor, authorized under the Brahm Oduya provision, installed at the far reach of his new corridor assignment. He set the reserve to 112%. He did not ring the bell for the 2 ships in that corridor, whose return windows had already passed. He was not entirely sure that was right. He was completely sure that the certainty he would have had 2 months ago, the clean, documented certainty of the bell, had been incomplete in a way that mattered. The difference was small enough to hold in one hand and large enough to change what you did with it. Back at Lamplight, the evening calibration ran on schedule. The signal went out on the 22nd cycle, the same as it had for 40 years, the same as it would tomorrow. As long as Solveig Han was here, and the fuel cell was full and the array was aligned, 112% reserve. Okoye came out of the bunk room and stood in the doorway of the operations room, watching the board. The second chair at the workstation was empty between them. It had been empty for 27 years, and it was not going to be filled tonight, and they both knew it without discussing it, and the knowledge sat in the room. Honestly, the way true things sit. Out past the Marrow's edge, on a bearing Solveig had been watching for 4 days without mentioning it to anyone yet. A new signal whispered at the outer edge of Lamplight's receiver range. Faint. Real. On a frequency that matched nothing in the current active registry and everything in the dead files she had never let herself delete. She checked the fuel cell, 112% reserve. The light stayed on,